This video is sponsored by MPB.
What focal length you choose for your street photography matters, because if you find that focal length that you like, that is the way that you see the world, that helps you to tell the stories that you want to tell, and then you run the thread of that focal length through your work, it really gives some consistency to your visual voice. This advice won't apply as much to those of you who prefer to go out into the street and shoot with a zoom lens. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that if you like to change your focal length on the fly. But I'm going to guess that even those of you who choose to shoot on a zoom tend to gravitate towards one or the other end of those focal lengths that you have in that lens. And there might be something to pay attention to in that. There was a rough trajectory to the focal length journey that I went on as I experimented with different lenses, trying to work out which fit me best. And I thought that today, by sharing that journey with you and the lessons that I learned along the way, it will help those of you who are struggling to work this out to find which focal length fits your way of seeing and capturing the world. So I started shooting street photography on an 85mm focal length, and there was a very simple reason for that. It's the only lens I owned. The story went that I went in to buy my first DSLR, which was a Canon 350D back in the day, but unfortunately the camera store at the time only had the bodies in stock. They didn't have any of the 18 to 55mm kit lenses available. But the helpful guy in the camera store said, "Don't worry," and he reached behind him and he picked off the shelf a second-hand Canon 50mm f1.4, and he said to me, "Take this, we'll give you a good price on it, you'll absolutely love it." And I was a real noob at the time. I didn't know whether it was a good lens or exactly what it would do for me, but I bought it and that's what I walked out with, my 350D and a Canon 50mm f1.4. Most of you will know that when you team a 50mm lens with an APS-C sensor, as was in the 350D, you get a roughly 85mm focal length equivalent. So I started to go around and take images with it, and I loved how I could pick out individual subjects. And that f1.4 gave me a lot of options for throwing the background out of focus with a shallow depth of field and really isolating subjects. So as I photographed my friends or my daily wanderings, I loved this ability to be able to hone in on one very specific thing, to pick out details and separate them from the background, which would just become that kind of creamy bokeh. 85mm or even longer is a perfectly legit focal length for street photography, and many photographers use it to great effect, making creative use of subject isolation and giving us smooth, out-of-focus backgrounds, which can add a cinematic quality to the shots, and even some mystery as to the context of where we find the subjects in the images. But somewhere along the way I got bored and felt a little limited by just shooting single subjects and isolating them, and I wanted to start to include more context in the images that I was taking. And it was about this time that I picked up my first full frame camera, which was the Canon 5D Mark II, which by the way is a camera that still holds a really special place in my heart for how much it helped me to develop not just my photography, but also my filmmaking. Putting that 50mm 1.4 lens on a proper full frame now gave me a true 50mm focal length. And as I went around and started to experiment with this, something really clicked with me. I thought, this is quite true to the way that I see the world. I'm moving in the right direction. And I've always felt that 50mm is a very kind of classic focal length. There's no distortion to the image, and there's a great balance between still being able to pick out subjects and isolate them in the frame, but also to include some context to aid in my storytelling. 50mm is a legitimate, and some might suggest, a very traditional focal length for street photography. Famously, Henri Cartier-Bresson most often used a 50mm as his lens of choice, and since then street photographers the world over have chosen this very versatile focal length as their way of capturing the world, because it holds a unique middle ground between context inclusion and subject isolation. I've been using that full frame 50mm combo for a while and really enjoying it, but at some point I got fed up with having to carry a backpack with DSLRs and lenses with me when I went out into the street. I wanted something smaller and more compact, and I did what a load of other photographers did at the time, and I went down to the local camera store and I bought the first Fuji X100. It had terrible autofocus, and in my case, because I bought a second-hand one, it had a bunch of dead pixels on the sensor as well, so it had lots of quirks, but I absolutely loved that camera. So now with the X100 I have a 23mm lens on an APS-C sensor, which gives me roughly a 35mm focal length. And 35mm was wider than I was comfortable with at the start. It took a lot of getting used to. And my photography had a big shift moving from 50mm to 35mm because I noticed that I was starting to look for scenes more than I was looking for subjects with that field of view. And it was about this time I also started to notice light and shadow in space and to experiment with that as a subject matter. The focal length itself was teaching me to recognize different things. I was no longer looking for the details as much. I was now taking in the whole space and the scene in front of me. My view had widened out. And lots of you will know when you shoot on one focal length for a while, you walk around and start to see in that focal length even when you don't have your camera with you. My world really felt like it was opening up at that point. And even though I can identify that moving to 35mm from 50mm was the biggest perspective shift I had on that focal length journey, I very quickly became used to it and it started to feel like a really comfortable way to see and capture the world. Again, 35mm is a very popular choice among street photographers. Famously, Joel Meyerowitz loved the 35mm focal length because he said it felt it was the closest angle of view to our human eye, which is why it felt most natural to him on the streets, and I would agree. There are a whole slew of street photographers working today who use 35mm as their focal length of choice because it allows them the versatility of capturing wider scenes or just taking a few steps closer to capture subjects with context, all with one prime lens. And then came the fateful day when I walked into a camera store and picked up a second-hand Ricoh GR2, which I upgraded to the GR3 soon afterwards, and that was an 18mm lens projected onto an APS-C sensor, which gave me a 28mm focal length. And you might have noticed up to this point that my focal length journey has been getting wider and wider, from 85mm to 50mm to 35mm. I'm finding my comfort level with each of those to some extent, but moving to 28mm, I found the limit of my comfort zone, and I realized that this was a focal length I was going to struggle with. To this day, 28mm is wider than I like to shoot. As a focal length, it isn't for me, but 28mm is again a very legitimate choice for street photography. Gary Winogrand's work is a great example of a very creative and loose use of the 28mm, and there are a load of contemporary photographers out there today using 28mm either to shoot scenes where you can include a lot more in the frame and tell a more detailed story where many things are happening in a moment, or to get close to subjects, embrace the distortion, and even create some discomfort for the viewer. Focal length choice is a very subjective thing. There's no right answer. You have to find the focal length that fits you and the way that you see subjects and the world at large. And it's a really important decision to make, not just for the way that it's going to compress the scene in front of you in the lens, but also because people forget what an important element the frame around your image is in composing the shot. So you have to find that focal length that helps you to compose in the way that's natural to you. When I tried 28mm, for example, I quickly realized it's not for me. It's not the way that I see. It takes too much into the frame. And it was using that focal length that made me realize that actually focal length is often a gut feeling. We have to ask ourselves if over time we're actually connecting with it and it's helping us to tell the stories that we want, or if it's holding us back. And it's important to pay attention to these things. Are you using a focal length at the moment, but you find that you're constantly having to back up because you're too close to subjects to be able to frame them in the way that you want? Well, then maybe your focal length is too narrow. And conversely, do you find yourself having to step closer all the time because you're too far away from the subjects you want to capture? Or are you always cropping in on your image? Maybe the focal length you're using is too wide and it's not the way that you see the world. With the lens that you're currently using, do things feel like they're flowing well, or do you constantly feel like you're battling? Is it helping you to come home with more keepers at the end of the day? Do things feel like they're clicking, or is it maybe time for a change and to try something new? In my case, the pendulum had to swing from 85 on the one end, which I found was too narrow a focal length, through to 28mm on the other end, which I realized was too wide for me, to realize that I am a 35mm to 50mm guy, depending on the subject that I'm shooting or the lighting on any given day. So for me, on a normal day out on the streets when the light is good and the sun is out, my focal length I've worked out is 35mm. That's how I see the world. And I was really grateful last year when Ricoh brought out this GR3X, which is a 40mm, which is right in my wheelhouse. It's not too far away from 35, but a nice pocket camera form factor. So now my most used focal length by far is that 40mm. But if I didn't have that camera, it would be an X100 or something similar that gives me that 35mm field of view out and about. But on days when the light is flat and I can't use the high contrast light and shadow to separate elements in my frame or isolate my subjects, I go to 50mm. That's my focal length of choice because it helps me to compress the image a little bit and to isolate subjects using a shallower depth of field instead. I might make another video digging in on this a little bit more another day, but 50mm has also become my portrait focal length. And interestingly, my portrait focal length journey took a very similar trajectory. It went from narrow to wide. I started 135 and then went to 100 and then to 85. And now I've landed at 50mm and I've realized that's the way that I see portraits. That's how much context I want to include in the background. That focal length is right for me. I think I can honestly say that if I wanted to strip my kit down to as little as possible, I could now quite happily live the rest of my life with one full frame camera body, two if you want some redundancy, and a 35mm lens and a 50mm lens. That's it. And that's a really freeing realization to have made because it means that I've worked out my way of seeing the world and found the lenses and focal lengths that work for the sort of images that I want to make, at least for now. But I have to say that I learned a lot through all those pendulum swings and none of it was wasted time because as I tried different focal lengths, each of them taught me something different. And that's the best piece of advice I can give you. If you haven't found your focal length yet, try something new. Not for a day, because if you try a new lens for a day, it's probably going to be frustrating right off the bat because you're not used to it. But try it for a while. And like I said, it's not wasted time because even if that new focal length doesn't become your new focal length of choice, I promise you it will teach you a lot. Narrower focal lengths taught me how to focus on the details and isolate subjects. It taught me to recognize different things when I was walking around, those little things that everyone was walking past and not noticing. It taught me to tell stories in the details, like a face picked out of a crowd, or hands folded behind somebody's back, or a discarded item on the floor that tells a story all its own, or a balloon in a tree telling the stories of the beauty in the little things. But wider focal lengths have absolutely taught me about composition. When I was shooting on the GR2 and GR3 at 28mm, it meant that everything was usually in focus and there was a lot included in the frame, and it was my job as the photographer to wrangle all those elements in the shots and place them where I wanted them so that the image felt balanced and it told the story that I wanted to tell. So those wider focal lengths have been invaluable to help me with my composition. In fact, if I'm really honest with you, I think the reason that my focal length journey started narrow is because I wasn't very confident with my composition skills. I had a feeling that if I went to those wider focal lengths straight away, that I wouldn't know how to place the elements in the frame and I would make a mess. But slowly, as things began to widen out over time, and as I got to that 28, those composition skills strengthened at each stage along the way and really strengthened at 28. And even though I didn't stay there and I moved back to the middle to 35 and 50, I bring those compositional skills I've developed along the way with me. So what's your focal length choice and why? On this video, I really want to encourage you to go down into the comments section and post the focal length that really works for you and give us your reason why that's the right choice for the sort of images that you make. And then if you're a photographer that's really struggling to land on the right focal length for yourself, hopefully by reading through everybody else's choices and listening to their subjective reasons why those focal lengths work for them, it will give you some ideas about a different focal length to try and experiment with going forward so you can discover your way of seeing and capturing the world. Lastly, thanks again to MPB for sponsoring this episode. They're a great online platform for buying and selling used camera gear. MPB will appeal to two groups of photographers, and the first are those like me who prefer to buy used camera gear to save a bit of money. But when you buy through a reputable seller like MPB, not only do you get a fair price based on the condition of the gear that you're buying, you also get a 6-month warranty for peace of mind. And the second group are those photographers who found that they're just collecting too much gear that they're not using, that their gear shelves and their camera bags are just cluttered and filled up with stuff that doesn't get much use. MPB will buy that gear off you. And I like the idea that then that unused gear that sits in my camera bag goes onto their platform and then stands a chance of being bought by another photographer or filmmaker who will get good use out of it. Getting a quote for your gear is easy, and if you accept the offer they give you, they will even send a courier around to pick the item up from you. All you need to do is box it up, put a label on it, and they will even give you a 1-hour slot when the courier will arrive, which will save you a trip to the post office. It couldn't be simpler. So whether you're looking to buy a quality used camera body or lens, or you want to sell some gear on, or you want to do both in one transaction, MPB are a great option. I will leave a link to their platform down in the description below. Go along and check them out.